Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. And what a pleasure to be here. And of course, first of all, to congratulate South African Cities Network on exiting adolescence. And what I wish for the next 20 years is a proper rebellious phase, because you've been far too decent and orderly in the last 10 years, being a very studious and engaged organization. But yeah, what a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. Of course, we're 1 week away from COP27, so it is also a really timeous moment to, if you will, tune into, as the moderator said, what is a global conversation and a global moment of urgency. And South Africa, in some ways, is being looked towards as again providing leadership, particularly from the African continent's perspective, in this global conversation. And so, because I had absolutely no idea what a masterclass is, and I still don't, I did Google it, and you end up with some really weird stuff that you can do on YouTube. I am kind of just going to try and provide a roadmap of the global debate, the South African national just transition, and then work that we've been privileged to do as the African Centre for Cities with the World Bank and the City Support Program for the Presidential Climate Commission on unpacking what a just urban transition will be. And that will be the main focus of the presentation today. And just to say that this is ongoing work, so I'm speaking a little bit out of class today, but of course, in the spirit of the festival and in the spirit of the role that the South African Cities Network plays, I can't think of a better place to be somewhat truant, if you will. And hopefully South African Cities Network will be inspired by some rebelliousness. So let me dive straight into it. So please feel free, again, as the moderator indicated, to kind of interject, shout out, and so on, because I didn't know what a masterclass is, and because I've got to kind of build this frame for you. It's a little bit dense and a little bit long, so at any moment, just chime in, but I will try and make sure that there's a good, solid 15, 20 minutes at the end for us to get stuck into some of the issues. Wow, you guys are so tech savvy. Look at that, I can see my slides over there. And I don't even have to wear my reading glasses. Thanks, Satole, I appreciate it. So I think it is important, because we often hear these words, to just spend a little bit of time to remind ourselves of why we're talking about an emergency. And of course, we've had our own visceral experience in many parts of South Africa in the last year or so. But I think it's good to put that in a global context. And I'll share with you 1 or 2 videos by other talking heads about why COP27 matters. And then what are we really talking about? What is this global conversation, as a kind of a shorthand before I dive into the South African context. Where I want to end up with is, because of the focus of this session, is really this cannot be something that government does for us. It is simply not possible. Government can provide leadership and a framework, but this is the moment that requires a societal response. And I want to kind of end off with what that might involve, what are the opportunities to open up and to own this particular challenge facing South Africa. Now, I'm part of a global network of development practitioners in a group called 10 by 100. And basically, if you take the 6th assessment report that came out earlier in the year by the IPCC, we've got less than 1,000 days left as a species, as a planet, to plateau our emissions by 2025. Can you think of that? So that's 100 days. So what we've committed in this network is every 100 days we have a check-in with each other. Are we amplifying our work and our practice to make sure that that urgency is in fact recognized and responded to by everyone else? And I want you to take a moment and think about that 1,000-day window. What is your life, your professional ambition, your organization's mandates looking like in the context of just 1,000 days, given where we need to be, especially as a society that's 96% dependent on fossil fuels for our energy? Right? What are you doing? Both in your own life and in your organizational context. And it's not just that we've got to stabilize, we have to reduce by 43% emissions within the next 5 years, right? And this is an incredibly ambitious ask. And there is nothing that has come out of the last COP and in the preparation for COP27 that suggests we are going to get even close to doing what is required to achieve those Paris Climate Agreement commitments. So that's the context. So I want to ask our colleagues to just play 2 videos for us, which can help us kind of all get the same starting point before we dive deep into what this means in the South African context. Thanks.
4 more degrees will drastically change the world.
And the world are dealing with record extreme heat.
Storms have been causing deadly floods.
You could have mass melting of ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica.
If we don't act immediately, scientists say the consequences will be catastrophic.
3 degrees of warming is really disastrous.
Dealing with unprecedented heat waves and drought.
All day today, the rain falling so heavily and so quickly.
$10 billion. But recovery funds are tight.
Rescuers doing everything they can to reach survivors.
Time. What if we could buy ourselves time? What if we could go back in time, undo what we've done, and start over? I say what if, because that is simply impossible. As the world moves forward at an unprecedented pace, we need to find ways to keep up with change and with time. For the past 4.5 billion years, planet Earth has been thriving, growing, and constantly evolving. And while we've only been around for thousands of years, some of what we've done is irreparable. Now, our planet needs our help, and we're running out of time. In today's rapidly warming world, the climate crisis won't wait for anyone. That's where you come in. You, the decision makers, the game changers, the forward thinkers, the first responders, you who make things happen and get things moving. You can help give the Earth a fighting chance. And the time to do so is right now. There's no extra time.
This is your chance to step up.
To turn pledges to action and put our future back on the right track.
Let's talk about climate change. People are calling it the crisis of our time, and it is.
Climate change.
Climate change. Climate
Changes.
Climate change. But it's easy to get lost in this story. The science is dense and politics get in the way. World leaders are meeting in Madrid to talk about the climate crisis and how to slow it down. And they're under pressure from millions of people around the world calling for concrete action.
The empty promises are the same, and the inaction is the same.
So what exactly are we doing wrong, and how do we fix it? We're going to kick this off with some basic science, so bear with me, because this is important. Look at this graph. These are the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. But this spike in carbon dioxide at the very end, that took off during the Industrial Revolution. We started breaking CO2 records in 1950, and we haven't stopped since. Why? Well, scientists say there's a 95% chance that human activity is the cause. We've been burning more and more fossil fuels like oil and coal, which release CO2, to power our homes, factories, airplanes, and cars. There's also a lot more of us. The global population has tripled in the past 70 years. And we're consuming more products from animals that release another pollutant called methane. So all those gases are released into the air, and when sunlight gets into the Earth's atmosphere, some of the heat gets trapped, and the planet gets warmer. That's why they call it the greenhouse effect. But the concern is not that the Earth is getting warmer. It's that it's happening far too quickly.
But it's actually the warmest temperature on Earth since the last ice age. since 10,000 years ago.
The UN says that right now, our world is about 1 degree hotter than pre-industrial times. That's around the year 1800, which is okay. In fact, the UN says if we warm by 1.5 degrees before the end of the century, we should be fine. The UN even says 2 degrees would probably be all right. But again, the problem is speed. Because right now, we're on track to hit 1.5 degrees in only 10 years. And if we don't slow that warming down, it could mean catastrophe within my lifetime, and maybe yours too. And we're already getting a taste.
Climate change is here. Climate change is happening. We are well into the 6th mass extinction event.
Europe is currently colder than the Arctic.
More than 1,000 people being rescued just in the early morning hours of Sunday.
Millions of people are likely to suffer worsening food and water shortages.
Drought, which is now in its 10th year, is a phenomena that's here to stay.
We've never seen a year's worth of rain in less than 7 days.
Sea levels are rising about 3 millimeters a year because seawater expands as temperatures get warmer. Melting ice sheets and glaciers also add trillions of tons of fresh water into our oceans. People around the world are already losing their homes. And if things carry on, millions more of us will have to pack up too. Entire coastal cities could be underwater within 80 years, like Miami in the US or Osaka in Japan. Entire island nations in the Pacific could completely disappear.
Natural disasters becoming more and more intense, more frequent, with more devastating consequences. The dramatic impacts of drought in different parts of the world, all this is creating a situation that is a real threat to humankind, and we are not doing enough.
If 99% of doctors said to you, take this medicine or you will get really sick and probably die, you would take it. Who wouldn't take it? The problem is, at the moment, we don't have any medicine.
Now, there is a plan to slow all this down. Back in 2016, world leaders signed the so-called Paris Agreement. And the big pledge is to cap temperatures rising by 1.5 degrees or a maximum of 2 before the year 2100. So countries set their own targets on how much CO2 they emit. But here's the thing. 3 years after the agreement, global CO2 levels are still going up.
CO2 emissions have been going up the last year by 2%, so that's actually above the average of the last 10 years. So it's started to increase again, and it doesn't look too good.
In some ways, we're going backwards.
The United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country.
The US, one of the world's biggest polluters, has pulled out of the Paris deal. Russia and China are accused of not giving themselves ambitious targets in the first place. Turkey and Poland want to build more power plants that use coal. And then there's the skeptics.
It's a political decision that there is man-made global warming.
They forced the computer models to say, aha, human influence, CO2 and other stuff.
The ground-based temperature data has been massaged to show an increase, but the satellite data shows no increase.
On the other hand, there is positive momentum. There's more awareness, and some countries are making progress. India, Morocco, and the Gambia have massive renewable energy projects.
There are different countries doing things successfully. So some countries are, for example, making all public transport free in the cities. What a great way to encourage people out of their cars.
But experts say what's needed now is an even bigger push to change everything about the way we run our world.
Business as usual has got to change. Politics as usual has got to change. In order to combat that, we have to change the system that has allowed it to happen. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
And everyone can do that by, shifting to renewable energy, reducing the use of cars, use train more, cycle more, eat less meat, consume a bit more carefully.
So where does that leave us? Well, there's only so much bike riding and light bulb replacing that you and I can do every day. But the truth is that it's those everyday things that are going to change anyway. Even coffee could run out if farmers can't grow it. So the expert advice is that it's down to all of us to change our ways and shake things up, or climate change is going to do it for us. If there's a story you want to get your head around, let us know. Get in touch with us on Twitter or Facebook. Also, make sure to subscribe.
Thanks so much. Hopefully that was helpful to kind of just remind ourselves, what are we talking about, and doesn't take up all my time to go through all that detail. Now, of course, climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion is one meta trend facing us as we try and make sense of how to rethink and reposition our economies, our lives, the way we live, and so forth. Another meta trend is urbanization. And very importantly, the global north is aging, and in the global south, especially in Africa and in parts of Southeast Asia, there is an expansion of the youth component. And these, in Africa alone, we will treble the labor force between now and 2050, even though only 30% to 35% in most sub-Saharan African countries have people in the labor force in the formal economy. So there's a massive expansion of need for jobs, and most of our economies are informal. And of course, geopolitically, massive tensions, because the epicenter, the gravitational force field of the global economy is shifting away from North America and Europe to Asia. And that in itself is some of the convulsions we see with the Ukrainian war and other dynamics. And of course, lastly, digitization, which is radically going to alter the future of work. So you've got this confluence of the changing nature of work with an expanding labor market and predominantly informal economies. Now, yes, the climate crisis or emergency is a primary driver for action because of just the devastation that it causes and the risk implied in terms of existing infrastructure. But we have to triangulate across all of these dynamics, and not just at a national scale, but at a regional and at a global scale. So for us in the continent, the three big questions we've got to prioritize within this really complex story, of course, is climate change impacts, because not only is it of itself a humanitarian crisis, but it reverses the developmental gains we've made during the post-colonial era. Secondly, what we are seeing manifesting both within cities but at a larger territorial level is the deepening of what we now understand as multidimensional inequality. So it's not just about income inequality, but it's how that intersects with health inequalities, educational inequalities, and of course, extremely visible in the South African case, spatial inequality. And there's just too few jobs. Right? And one of the challenges, as I'll show you, is that because Africa is so marginal in the global economy, but highly dependent on global value chains, it has very little bargaining power to change the nature of, structurally, the nature of our economies. So just to kind of drive this point home, that we have to think about the climate question in relation to the inequality question. So this shows you by world region, and that is, it doesn't work with the screen. The sub-Saharan Africa, of course, because the economy is the smallest of all the world regions, but you can see the top 10% contributes more to CO2 emissions than the bottom 50% in all world regions, right? So it's, of course, most of the time we speak in aggregate, but there's, of course, an important distributional distinction to be made about who's responsible and what kind of lifestyles and consumerism drives the climate story. Now, we kind of now know, it's a public secret within the development world, that the current model of extractive capitalism is obsolete, right? The problem is that we don't really know what the post-capitalist frame is, and how to make decisions today to create the basis for that. And I'm not talking about socialism, I'm talking about something beyond extractive capitalism as we now experience it with all of its effects. One of the debates on the table is the donut economics frame that tries to balance kind of realizing socioeconomic rights without exceeding planetary limits. But it's kind of one moment within that broader debate. I'm sure there's lots of people in the room that can help us there. So why I'm putting this up is that I just want to remind us that there's a larger, if you will, paradigmatic conversation that is incomplete, that is unresolved. And so it makes it very, very difficult to figure out what's the right thing to do in the now, with an understanding that it will have cascading effects over the medium and the long term. So, in a way, what the just transition discourse allows us to do is to think through what do we do in the interregnum, while we're figuring out what this thing is, this beast that might emerge in, if you will, in the aftermath of all of this disaster and crisis and emergency that we know is confronting us. And so let's look at Africa. So one of the key milestones we've passed as a species in the last few weeks, the UN tells us, is there's 8 billion of us now. Okay, so we've passed that 8 billion threshold. The African share of that is about 17.5%. By the end of the century, we'll be 40% of the global population. That's how we roll. And but of course, we only account for under 5% of global GDP, right? So what that means is that our responsibility at the moment, and I'm starting with the Africa context because we cannot afford to disconnect the South African just transition conversation from our role within the Pan-African story. So we need to figure out what is an appropriate development pathway that remains low carbon while we are super high carbon, so for the rest of the continent, through the pursuit of green industrialization and sustainable settlement investments and maintenance. So it's really this infrastructure question and how we imagine and instantiate the way we live in towns and cities and rural areas that will make the difference. And because we've got to still make all of these investments on the continent, this is the right moment to think intelligently about this. I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but this is just a frame to appreciate that everyone is a developing country. None of the world's nations score well on the Human Development Index and ecological footprint. As you can see, the rich countries need to figure out how to come down into the blue box, and we, all the yellows or African countries, need to figure out how to tunnel through on a low carbon path to that green box. And this is the bigger question. So the just transition frame and the discussion about how we make these sectoral and value chain transitions is all about figuring out this broader picture. Now, over the last decade, of course, there's been a number of global events and moments, and we've heard in the documentary about the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where finally a consensus was reached about what's the targets we need to set in terms of global warming. Now, flowing from those things, there are two big national levers that the global community has agreed on. One is nationally determined contributions. That's where the way we figure out the 1.5 degree puzzle is every country says, this is what we are going to do to reduce our emissions. This is the time frame we're going to do it within, and we will achieve those goals, and you can hold us accountable. And it's really that commitment that underlies the Just Transition framework in South Africa. Because what the Presidential Climate Commission has been charged to do is to open up a national conversation about what are the trade-offs we need to make to achieve the goals set in the nationally determined contributions. Now, the other document that came out of Habitat 3 on national urban policies. And as urbanists, the great opportunity we have is to say, let's triangulate our national urban policy. In the case of South Africa, it's the IUDF. I knew I was going to stutter when I say that. And nationally determined contributions. And because the IUDF has kind of gone underground in some ways, I think, this is a great moment to dust it off and to see how through the work the PCC is doing with CSP and so on the just urban transition, to begin to align these two things and see how do we rethink, reformat, reprioritize the urban investments to make sure we achieve nationally determined contributions. Now, where does this all fit in? Sorry, our fonts don't speak to each other, so my diagrams are less elegant than they should be. This is kind of a standard generic frame about key national instruments, and as you can see, the NUPs and the NDCs are meant to inform that, and this is what we've done in South Africa. That T is actually a JT, but sorry, because of the fonts, it's disappeared. So kind of between the NDP and the National Growth Strategy, it's trying to intervene at that point and say, let's recalibrate to make sure we achieve our carbon reduction emissions. Now, of course, for South Africa, this is a massive ask because we are one of the worst emitters in the world. We're certainly by far the worst in Africa. And so what has been done over the last 2 years is the production of a framework which was adopted by Cabinet a few weeks ago. And this is what the PCC, which is the Presidential Climate Commission, I'm not going to go into the detail, you can download the report, but it's really to have this conversation with social partners about how not just government, but everyone in society will define their own policies and programs to make sure we achieve these goals. Now, very importantly, and I think admirably, the PCC has said we have to have the hard conversation. So if we are going to have sunset sectors like sort of decarbonizing by disconnecting ourselves from a coal-based energy system, what are we going to do with all of the workers and the companies and so forth that is in that value chain? And how do we make sure that we set targets for how we will retrain workers, we will reinvest in those businesses so that they can reorient themselves to clean energy sources and other related industries. And so there's a whole set of bodies of work that you can follow through their website and various public fora and events and so on. But what is important about the Just Transition Framework is that it tries to connect this difficult conversation about trade-offs with the constitutional imperative for substantive justice. And it takes three principles: restorative justice, distributive justice, and procedural justice, and says everything we do has got to meet those criteria. And that is the mechanism for structuring the public conversations around these questions, right? So is this the most just outcome or not? If we say that we are going to decarbonize at this rate, yes or no? And of course, you'll know what Labour might have to say on that, what other local communities who depend on those mining operations may have to say about that, or the coal fire stations and so forth. So keep that in mind. I'll come back to that. Now, the just transition, there's two main imperatives. There's a big piece on the mitigation side. In other words, how do we decarbonize the national economy? And if we are 96% dependent on coal, how do we rebalance the energy mix over the next 10, 20, 30 years, right? So there's an energy transition discussion that is happening that you can engage with. And then there's a whole piece on the adaptation side about how do we build resilient infrastructure, and how do we rethink the regulation and the planning of our cities and towns so that they are more resilient to climate change impacts. So what we've tried to do was to think through what this might mean at the urban scale from the perspective of a metropolitan government. And so obviously, this is particularly important. So this is just a graphic to show the sort of just next to China, the blue bar there, that's South Africa. We at around, this is slightly dated, this graph, we at around 9 tons of CO2 emissions per capita at the moment. But as you can see, we're an outlier relative to the rest of Africa, which is the first little blue bar on this side, above the middle chair on the stage. So our challenges, of course, are particularly unique because of the confluence of our history, right? So I don't need to go into the detail of that, but we obviously have to figure out what this transition means while attending to this other social crisis of large-scale structural unemployment and very, very limited prospects for young people to enter the labor market, and grotesque inequality. And so the starting point for the urban conversation is to say that, as we've seen globally, cities have a disproportionate leadership role to play. So when you saw in the video Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, what actually happened was that had a mobilizing effect on states and city governments in the US, and they were more or less able to keep up with the commitments despite the abdication of the federal government in the case of the US. And so we've seen cities in many parts of the world really take the lead, and a lot of South African governments, linking back to Hastings that you saw earlier in the video, C40's work with a lot of the metros, have also produced their own climate change adaptation plans and so on. So the argument is that what the metros can do is it can at least figure out how to buffer some of the impacts that will be inevitable, as we saw in Durban last year, or in the case of the drought in Cape Town a few years ago. Cities, because of their disproportionate economic footprint in the national economy, can drive the national decarbonization efforts. And the announcements yesterday around the acceleration of IPPs and new players into the renewable energy market, of course, is all part of that story. Looking at what are the new kinds of economies that we could be stimulating that are green, that are low carbon, and of course, building the coalitions of partnerships to align the finance. And I was struck in the previous panel how the green finance question didn't come up at all, right? That was striking. So we were like kind of talking as if the inherited fiscal framework we've built over the last 20 years is fit for purpose for where we need to go. Surely it's not, because there's very different calculus that has to go into what are the types of infrastructures, what's the role of green infrastructure, and most importantly, how do we rethink risk? Because that, of course, is the underlying calculus about whether investments are viable or not. But a conversation for another time. So there's been lots of modeling in this space. So what you see here is the potential role of cities. So what this diagram shows us the contribution of residential building, commercial building, transport, materials, waste, and so forth, that they can make to abate carbon emissions. The striped lines below, the slightly lighter shade, that is the additional benefit you get if you decarbonize the national energy system. Okay, so this just shows the interdependency between what the cities do and what the national effort is to decarbonize our energy backbone. Now you can see, going back to the opening quote, that 34% goal we have as a planet, and of course in our own indices we say what our contribution is, what that would look like in practice. So of course, if that is your goal and objective as a city, the way you do your infrastructure investment planning and how you finance that is a very, very different story to how it's been done over the last 27 years. So practically in the framework that will be in the public domain soon, it's being finalized and will be presented at the PCC plenary soon. We break down the intervention, so you're getting a sneak peek. Don't tell anyone. We break down the intervention points into these infrastructural sectors: energy, mobility, waste management, the built environment, which includes, of course, the construction sector, and the role of planning of that, and lastly, ecological infrastructure and nature-based solutions, which is one of the lowest hanging fruits to really mobilize communities in poor areas to be part of this larger process. We argue that each metro has these three levers: regulatory instruments, fiscal instruments, and then their leadership role in society. And we then connect that back to a menu of interventions, right? So I'm not going to go through the detail, don't worry, just pay attention to the highlights. So it's the sector, it's what can be done, it's what that breaks down into practical activities, and then what levers do you apply to achieve that change. So what we're trying to do here is to create a menu of conversation between the metropolitan governments and society, the private sector, community groups, trade unions, and so forth, to help a very focused conversation about the trade-offs and the choices and the priorities that need to be made. And we break this down into all of the sectors, and again, this is not the moment to go into the detail, but just to see what the rationale is, because what we're trying to do is to create the broadest possible frame for social engagement, for debate, for discussion, but also to help the metros think about what do they need to be transparent about in terms of the decision-making that they're undertaking. So we do the same with low-carbon mobility, expanding public transport, building low-emission vehicles, and in that case, of course, because there's a whole stream of work on the automotive sector in the PCC, we're trying to connect that back to understanding how this new value chain around EVs and the minerals that is required for the manufacturing of EV engines, how that could be located within space, right? And of course, certain of the metros are particularly well placed to be part of that conversation. And then we do that with waste management and the circular economy, the built environment, looking at the role of planning, settlement upgrading, with a strong focus on informal sector, And then lastly, the role of building regulations as a key driver of shifting to low carbon construction materials. So again, the point of today was not to take you through the detail of this, because that's not a masterclass, that's a master's degree over a year. But just to give you a flavor of what the frame is to think about this and how we can have an opening up. So that said, of course, we are exceedingly good in South Africa in building these planning and policy frames, right? So let's do a little bit of a reality check. We've got a social crisis because of the intersection of these things. And as we know from particularly media reporting on, I have no idea if it's true or not, what's going on in Johannesburg in the last couple of weeks, and I'm not talking about the disrepair of the politics, I'm talking about the water system and so on. We've got a real set of challenges. We know, as we've just heard in the previous panel, that revenue growth is not keeping pace with demand, and it won't anytime soon because, as we heard yesterday, growth of 1.4%, I think the minister said, is what we're hoping for next year. And then, of course, the coalition story is creating a context of profound instability, as again we've heard in the previous panel. And my personal bugbear, I hate the DDM, I think it's a disaster, and I think it's just creating utter confusion. And so, it is making it even harder to have a focused strategic conversation. And if you don't know what the DDM is, don't worry, you don't want to know. And then, so in terms of how does one activate social actors, kind of the main focus of this, those are the sectors we've identified. So there's these kinds of things that you can do. There's a whole piece on public understanding. We need to figure out new forms of planning that is much more engaged. For me, at the heart of this is building robust accountability. That's the key thing. Because we know change, transformative change, does not come from fantastic policies. It comes from social pressure, from citizenship. And that doesn't happen if there isn't meaningful accountability. And then sort of my own interest in this really is how do we create a milieu for experimentation and innovation, because there is just no way without testing different things that we are going to do things differently. So this is just a framework my colleague at ACC, Gareth Haysom, has been developing, trying to think through all of these complicated areas, right? To kind of just help us think a bit more systematically, that there's an authorizing environment. A lot of the people in this room, you live in this world. You represent local government, national government, and so forth, national departments and so on. And then there's civil society, which is the activating environment. And you can't really implement anything without connecting with the activating environment. And that's complex. Multiple interests, diverse actors, and so forth, messy. And of course, the relationships between these things change over time. And the challenge we face within the just transition or the just urban transition intervention is we've got to somehow figure out how to mediate these various needs and wants and so forth and find alignment so that we can prioritize. And that applies to all of those sectors that I've spoken about. But we need a set of intermediary institutions that can help us do that work. Good example is the Economic Development Partnership, but there are others. I presume the Gauteng Partnership Fund might be one of those. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the work, but I saw partnership in the name, so I presume it does intermediary work. And of course, all of that happens not in a nice, cozy environment. We live in a tough political and social context. Corruption is rife. Limited state capacity, power politics, and so on. So, so let's not kind of get too starry-eyed too quickly, but the point is just really is that there is a real issue here. And so organizations like the South African Cities Network, like SALGA, like these various institutions that help facilitate shared perspectives and build a basis for joint action are absolutely indispensable in creating the framework for this. So let me conclude then on the difference innovation makes. We have to foster city-level societal capacity to promote and learn from hundreds of experiments. I've given up on the idea that we figure out something works and you scale it, right? That's our assumption. We all assume that's how it works. I don't think it works that way. I think what we actually need is a multiplicity of experiments, because often in city context, innovation is very site-specific, neighborhood-specific, street-level specific. And so can we create a framework where a multiplicity of things can flourish, and we can, if you will, celebrate all of that and somehow harness that collective energy without thinking you've got to replicate everything at scale. And so there's a mindset shift there, which I want to encourage us to think through. And the importance, I think, is that the more we can proliferate that, the better. And one of the things that requires is to fundamentally and radically rethink regulation. And so there's work with colleagues all over the world where we're trying to really work out, if you take the different, if you will, drivers of urban economies and settlement, and you think about how one can begin to re-articulate these in an intelligent way through good data, as we've heard in the previous session, but also very simple mechanisms, applications and so forth, to help think much more intelligently about how we aggregate capital, how do we ring-fence risk and so forth, we can begin to have a very different form of distributed, democratic, decentralized planning. So in summary, we are out of time, 1,000-day window. The Just Transition Framework provides us with a shared platform to build a new social imaginary and narrative so that we can address all of our wicked issues in South Africa. Cities must take the lead in decarbonization and green industrialization and what I would call sustainable urbanism. And cities can make the biggest impact by recasting what infrastructure investment means, how that connects with urban design, and investing in green infrastructure. Justice Principles gives us a tool to prioritize infrastructure modalities and investments, navigate the difficult trade-offs, because there are many. And each domain of urban climate action provides us with a range of opportunities for social action. So there's a positive story here. There's a story of space for experimentation, for getting involved, for action, and for imagination to flourish. But everyone has got to be alive to the dialectic interplay of the authorizing environment, the enabling environment, and the messy work of knitting these things together through strategic intermediation. And finally, go and join or invent or an experiment, act, learn, contest, share, and most importantly, do something already. So thank you very much for your attention. We've got 3 minutes and 19 seconds and counting for questions. I didn't keep to my promise, my apology. But please, any comments, reflections, questions? And while you raise your hand and the microphone moves around, I wish I had time to also play you the B-roll. You do need to go and download this speech by the Prime Minister of Barbados at the last COP. Was simply off the hook. So do yourself the favor and listen to it. It will change your life. Okay, with my evangelical call to action over, questions, comments, reflections. Thanks for your attention.
Any questions from the audience? There we go. We've got one hand. Happy to take one more from the back if need be.
The big man himself. Olga.
Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to be here first time. I've got two questions. One around emission from electricity generation. Can't we use that steam that comes from those turbines to turn it to alternative source, capturing it from where it's being emitted? Two, it's a bit controversial around the climate change vis-a-vis the floods. I noted when that cable on the eastern coast was rolled down the Durban side, there was floods, same day. To me, it was like, the press said, it's like sea level is gone up.
Mm-hmm.
Who's supposed now to compensate for that? Because I think it's true that this built environment, that these bridges and buildings in the sea I think the gods are damn crazy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take that as a reflection and a remark. And just on your first question about can we harness the steam, the problem is that I don't have an answer for you about technologically if we can, but the problem is once it becomes steam, the CO2 has already been emitted. And that's the problem. So maybe we can or can't harness the steam, but that doesn't solve the problem that by burning coal to generate energy, we emit way too much CO2. And that's the problem that's causing the greenhouse effect. Sithole?
Okay, thanks, Edgar. So yesterday, Phil Harrison said, we don't need to be building more cities or more towns.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of agree with him. We have to be solving the problems of the ones that we have. He made an example about the Eastern Seaboard, and his comment was, just fix KSD, municipality, or Umtata, then you've solved the better part of the problem. Secondly, you yourself have just said the last panel did not in any way make mention of the green financing, right? That has to go down to municipalities. The point about the two comments then I'm making is that even this work around just transitions or just energy transition is very limited in how it involves those that are supposed to be practicalizing and turning the decisions into practice. And that's part and parcel of the problem that we're going to have. So there's work, good work that's being done, but there's limited or almost non-involvement of the decision makers and the decision implementers that are at a local level. Thanks.
So I will, so I wasn't here for Phil's remarks, but I'm pretty sure I know what he argued. And of course, in the South African case, that's very much true, that, you know, we've got such incredibly rich built stock in our existing cities, and by retrofitting and rethinking the use of those, you know, we can achieve a lot more than the fantasy of new cities. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different story, because you're talking about rates of growth at a speed that is much higher than here. And there you've got to think of the whole spectrum, from new cities to retrofits to upgrading and so on. So I think we just need to be careful that there's a South African nuance to that debate, but outside of South Africa, there's a slightly different frame to that debate. And on the last point, obviously I can't agree with you more, and I'm pretty sure that at the heart of the South African Cities Network's mandate for the next 5-10 years is precisely that convening role as one of the key intermediaries in that process. Okay.
There's a lady with the microphone. You can go ahead, ma'am. In the interest of time, we'll try to keep it to that. There will be a networking opportunity to engage further. But you can go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Edgar, for a very insightful presentation. Two questions. Your presentation stitches to a large extent this concept around how we get government, community, labor to get around a common table and agree on what needs to happen. Now, we have a system of governance that has tried to promote that through cities and local government with what committees and all of that process of participation. And it's inherent and built into legislation. Now, we have had what we call social compacting. We have had, you can come with all the different terms around it. What is not working, and why do you think this will work differently? And what do we need to change?
Sure.
So that's the first question. The second one is linked to what Sithole talked about, is that I think we have come to really appreciate, unlike Trump in the US, we are quite mindful of the implication and the emergency we confront with climate change. The question I would like to understand, and with your benefit sitting in the PCC, is what is practically expected to happen, and what is that very defining role that government should play to allow for the lower tier of those two circles you presented to get to act and address issues of climate change.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I really appreciate the promotion to the PCC. I will inform Comrade Vali. I'll do it in the reverse order. So as I've showed in the framework, what we think the main issue is to start with the existing competencies and mandates of city governments, of municipal governments, and to say in each of those domains, because there's already infrastructure plans and so forth, is can you review those and redefine them in relation to the framework? So that will be the first task. Secondly, do it in a way that engages your social partners in a meaningful manner and not, I think we can all agree that the mechanisms that municipalities deploy to engage citizens is very performative. It's not substantive. And so they kind of do the checkbox, but they're not really interested in critical feedback and learning and doing things differently. And that touches then on your first question. So I have no problem with the ward committees and social compacts and so on. That's fine. And they kind of help to give a certain ritual and structured dimension to social engagement. But they are not effective. The evidence is very clear on that. And on the ward committee side, because it has been politicized in a very particular way that plays into the complexities around how political parties embed themselves in communities and at neighborhood level, that is structured through a patronage-based system. So that's, from a sociological point of view, that's not a surprise. So I don't think that means we've got to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to figure out the checks and balances with that system to make it better. But what we do need is we need to invest greatly in neighborhood scale, community-driven forms of planning so that citizens can be much more empowered in figuring out how they want to live, what's the public infrastructures they need to augment and enhance their livelihood strategies, and have access to some budget from the municipality to activate some of that. The deal is, and this is the compact piece, they have to be part of the implementation solution. And the only way we are going to get substantive citizenship is if we build that kind of institutional infrastructure and we publicly fund it. And that is not related to the ward committees, because the problem is then you end up again with the political party dynamics that tend to overdetermine how that works. So there's been quite a bit of discussion from the MPC days about what that could be in the form of civic academies or citizenship academies and other things that can really empower neighborhood organizations, civil society groups to have the skills to do that level of planning and engagement. And nothing has really come of it, and it's kind of an incomplete piece of democratization, but that would be, for me, a starting point to address some of your questions. Thanks.
We've been given the liberty to take one more question before we do wrap up for tea, so you can go ahead, sir. I understand you have the microphone. It is on.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks, Edgar, this is really excellent, but I want my master's degree now. That's question number one. I'm really excited with the whole context. So one question is, the just transition framework that has been developed and really at the draft stage, how can we, I wanted to bring that agenda beyond the South African context. So we have a diverse context across sub-Saharan Africa, and the need is still there.
Yeah.
How could we really benefit from, how could really the rest of Africa benefit from that? Another area of this innovation and scaling at city level, so many areas and celebrate all. What about the application of that in terms of cost? The purpose of really innovation and pilot and then scale is really attached with the costs.
Yes.
I just wanted to hear more about that. Thank you very much.
Great. So, Aklilu, my brother, they're going to think you were planted, right? So this one, I had an advertorial to make that I forgot about, and he's reminded me, and the advertorial is this. On the 22nd to the 23rd of November, ACC and with the World Resource Institute that Aklilu represents, and C40 and ICLEI and other partners, we've got a 2-day engagement on this topic of sustainable infrastructure as a Pan-African conversation in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town. Go to the ACC website to register. Limited places, really, because we want to have an intimate conversation. So for me, that's where that conversation will happen, is how do we build a learning frame for the continent that we can begin to share these different approaches and lessons and so on. And I think South Africa can greatly benefit from understanding how some of these issues are tackled in other contexts on the continent. There's a longer story there about that learning network, which I don't have time to get into, but happy to talk in the break. On the cost side, and this is the one part that I can't believe I didn't have time to get to, because actually in a lot of the international work that I do, I do the reparations talk, right? So of course, that inequality slide that I showed you speaks to the fact that the Global South, there needs to be a net resource transfer from the Global North to enable both the mitigation and the adaptation to happen. Commitments were made in Paris, 100 billion per annum, should have been achieved by 2020. We are a long way off from that target. They're expecting that by 2024 it might realize, but that has got to be understood in the context that 100 billion per annum transfer was in fact a compromise number. The real cost is about 2 to 3 trillion per annum. That should be realized. So that's the financing gap. So I think that there's a political piece to this that the Global South needs to continue to punt, which will be a little bit muted. It will be a big theme in Egypt next week, but it won't be, I don't think it will have the same level of political punch, because we've not had sufficient mobilization across the G77 in preparation for this. The fact of the matter is, with the Ukrainian war, with what's happened with the global economy, inflation and so forth, the actual envelope of resources is disappearing. Germany is 100 billion from Germany's side into the war effort. They've slashed their budgets by something like 60% for a lot of these efforts over the last year alone. So we're in trouble, so we need to make political noise, but most importantly, we need much more effective solidarity across the Global South to really unlock the resources that's needed, because that is really where the money is. I mean, there is no other way to get to it. Thanks.